The situation in the Pacific was now so urgent, new Hellcats were pressed into service as quickly as they could be produced. Within a few weeks of completion at Bethpage, a Hellcat would already be stationed on board a carrier thousands of miles away, flying missions in the vicious island-hopping campaign toward Japan.
Well, Hellcats were primarily flown off aircraft carriers. There were some land-based ones, but it was primarily a carrier-based plane, and they would serve to protect the fleet, defend it from attacking Japanese aircraft. They would also go on fighter sweeps over Pacific Islands where they would attack Japanese aircraft on the ground. They would pave the way for invasions, like for Iwo Jima, where they would attack targets on the ground, anything they could find to destroy before the Marines went ashore. And they were escorting long-range missions. They were attacking Japanese shipping. From 1944, once they were getting close to Japan, they would attack any Japanese shipping with bombs and rockets that they could find. So it was really a multi-use plane. It was used as a fighter and a fighter bomber for attacking other aircraft and targets on the ground or in the sea.
When scout planes over the open water reported contact with Japanese ships, relaying the enemy position and force size, the carrier crews sprung into action. As planes launched one after another into a hazardous sky known to be prowled by a tenacious enemy, all the training and experience of the young pilots was put to the test in furious battles. Hellcats flew missions strafing and bombing enemy ships and ground forces on the islands of the South Pacific. The Hellcat showed its deadly strengths over and over, helping to push the Japanese forces back across the Pacific, gaining bases and dominance of areas closer and closer to the Japanese mainland. Pilots developed special tactics to make use of the Hellcat's relative strengths against the speedier Zeros. The Zero could easily outmaneuver and outclimb the large, heavy Hellcat. Engaging in a dogfight with a Zero was avoided at all costs. Upon contact, the Hellcat dove into attack, pouring lead into the light, frail structure of the Zero. The Japanese planes could not hope to survive hits from the Hellcat's assault, often shattering and breaking up completely under the hail of bullets. Again and again, this approach proved successful, and the Zero pilots were suddenly at a loss to defend themselves, let alone mount effective attacks on the American fighters. The heavy Japanese losses took many of the most experienced combat pilots, leaving the gaps to be filled by younger, greener flyers. In desperation, Japan resorted to the infamous kamikaze suicide attacks. The aircraft, and tragically even the pilots themselves, were considered expendable in the service of a hopeless cause. The Hellcat's unparalleled firepower made it the most deadly fighter of the war, credited with the destruction of over 6,000 enemy planes. Carrying 400 rounds for each of its 6-wing mounted Browning 50 caliber machine guns, the F-6F inflicted huge damage in both air-to-air and strafing runs. 2 1,000-pound bombs carried under the fuselage posed a lethal threat to Japanese shipping, unlucky enough to be spotted below. The 6 5-inch rockets mounted under the wings could be especially effective in vicious attacks on ground targets to prepare the way for invading troops. The Hellcat annihilated the Zeros and was responsible for 3/4 of the kills by Navy and Marine pilots. Just 270 F-6Fs were destroyed in combat. A Hellcat pilot could truly appreciate the deadly power put at his disposal.
I think you have to put yourself in the perspective of a 20, 21-year-old naval aviator at the time who maybe had 300 hours of flying time, which may sound like a lot if you're thinking about going out and buying 300 hours of flying time. That's a lot of time. But in a fighter, that's not a whole lot of time. So you got neophyte aviators. And they're on a carrier someplace in the middle of the Pacific, and their job is to fly 100, 200 miles away from the carrier, engage the enemy, and turn around and fly back and land on the carrier. Well, there's some problems in doing that. It's not an easy mission. First off, you had to maintain radio silence with a carrier often so that the enemy couldn't figure out where the carrier was. Sometimes you'd come back at night. Sometimes you'd have combat damage with the airplane, and sometimes the crews would be wounded. So you take this young kid out doing this mission way out over the Pacific, and his airplane gets shot up, and he's got to bring this thing back and land it aboard a carrier. It's a very daunting task, and the last thing you need is an airplane that's got some peculiarities in its handling quality, some less reliable components in it that mean you've got some other problem to deal with on top of all of that. And the Wildcat was the airplane that didn't have any of those. It was a very nice handling airplane, had very honest handling characteristics, could sustain a lot of combat damage and still be a flyable airplane to bring back and land on the carrier. I guess the success rate of it speaks for itself. It had a 17-to-1 victory ratio over the enemy. So you can imagine that the pilots really fell in love with the airplane. In fact, I guess one pilot summarized it in a soundbite when he said, if I could teach my Hellcat to cook, I'd marry it after the war. And I crossed just a little bit my flying career, the start of my test flying career at Grumman, crossed a little bit with the end of some of the pilots who had done the test flying of these World War II airplanes. And when you talk to them about handling qualities and how a fighter should behave, they would frequently use the F-6 as a benchmark as being such a delightfully harmonized flight controls and honest airplane at the stall, and just really a delightful airplane to handle.
Whether on ship or in the air, naval aviators were always prepared for immediate action, as they were always in constant danger. An F-6F pilot did have some reassurance, though, in the ruggedness of his aircraft. Hellcats could take a huge amount of punishment without harm to the pilot and without needing to be ditched. Grumman was informally known as the Iron Works, for good reason. Incidents were related in which a wounded Hellcat, followed by an enemy fighter, would take fire until the attacker's ammunition ran out and still managed to make its way back to safety. The difficult carrier landings took their toll on many planes. But even when a Hellcat was nearly destroyed in a crash landing on deck, many pilots walked away unharmed or with only minor injuries.